Hey guys. I'm Jack, one of the co-founders of Sherlock. Sherlock is a auditor, hybrid audit contest provider. We also do smart contract coverage. This talk is actually going to be setting up for a talk I will do at 4 o'clock. So it's kind of in two parts here. And the reason for giving this talk is I talk to a lot of investors and protocol teams and different people in the space who recommend audit firms from time to customers. And when they recommend these audit firms, the process by which they do it is very kind of under the surface. Oh, thank you. It's a little bit opaque, and the entire auditing industry is a little bit opaque in terms of which auditors are performing well in different areas, on different code bases, with different protocols. And so one thing that I think would be really great is if we could kind of bring this process, because we're doing it anyways. These investors, these protocol teams, they're recommending specific audit firms, but it's kind of a dark pool process, and I think it'd be great to kind of bring that more into the light and try to have a more transparent way of evaluating which auditors are performing well so that these recommendations can be more based in, I guess, transparent facts instead of whatever's happening now kind of behind the scenes. So I guess a slightly more adversarial way of saying what this talk is about is it would be very interesting to see if there are certain audit firms or auditors in the space who are kind of swimming naked while everyone else isn't, and maybe not pulling their weight in the way that their customers might hope in terms of their performance. So the main question that this talk and the following talk is going to be about is, if we're looking at the same code base, well, the same version of a protocol, same protocol team, and this protocol gets multiple audits, which happens more and more these days. It's more and more frequent. You see protocols getting 2 audits, 3 audits, even 6 and 8 audits on a very similar code base. The question we're trying to get at is, which of these 4, 6, 8 audits is most effective? So we can actually do this right now. If we have a protocol, which happens from time to time, and the team basically gives 2 auditors the job and says, here's a commit hash, please find the vulnerabilities in this code base. As long as a few things are the same, the same scope, the same start date, we can actually get a pretty good sense of which auditor performed better by seeing which auditor found more critical vulnerabilities than the other. But of course, this is the best case scenario where you have all of these things lined up so that you can compare apples to apples. But in most cases, we don't have things lined up. We have a different commit hash. We'll go to the worst case scenario, where we have an auditor who uses a different severity criteria than another one. They start on different start dates, so the first auditor can see the findings, or the second auditor can see the findings of the first auditor. They're auditing different commit hashes. They're looking at a different scope. Some contracts are the same, some contracts aren't. And they get paid different amounts. The audits last different amounts of time. This worst case scenario is what we're going to try to quantify today and evaluate performance across today. So going to that first bullet point, different severity criteria. Different audit firms have different severity criteria. Some use frameworks of severity and likelihood across a 3x3 matrix. Others have custom definitions. And so the first thing that we need to do in order to evaluate the performance of different auditors is normalize the severity criteria, essentially. So you want it to be consistent, and you want to judge all of the findings in those audits according to that standard. Second one, different start date. This is trouble, because if the second auditor can see what the first auditor submitted, obviously you can't give credit to the second auditor for finding what the first auditor already found. So what we have to do is we have to evaluate audits in series instead of in parallel. So we have to say, okay, one is going to start in March, one's going to start in February, or sorry, one's going to start in January, one's going to start in February, one's going to start in March, and they're not going to be happening at the same time. They're going to be able to see each other's vulnerabilities. So we have to find a way to evaluate these audits kind of consecutively. The downside is that the last audit cannot be fully evaluated because you don't get to see any findings that they missed because there's no one that goes after them to try to find what they might have missed. Okay, so third bullet point, different scope. The way to solve this is just simply finding, okay, what are the shared contracts, what are the shared pieces of logic between audit number 1 and audit number 2, for example, and the performance of audit number 1 should only be evaluated on what was in scope for audit number 2, because audit number 2 can only find missed vulnerabilities from audit number 1 in the contracts that were in scope for both of them. All right, different commit hash. So obviously, if you get a different commit hash, it could be a timing thing, it could be a scope thing, it could be a few different things, but what you want to do is you want to find the diff between those two commit hashes, essentially, to figure out, okay, this function actually wasn't a part of the second audit, so we can't evaluate that function and how well audit number 1 performed in auditing that function. So we have to find the overlapping NSLOC number of source lines of code, and we have to evaluate audit number 1 based on the percentage of overlap with audit number 2. And the last one is different cost length. So this one's tricky. Some audit firms charge a lot, some audit firms charge way less, some audit firms say this takes a week, some audit firms say this takes 2 weeks. And so we're gonna introduce our first assumption for this performance criteria, and that is every audit is reasonably scoped. Every audit is a reasonably thorough review. And I think a lot of people might be used to kind of a different framework where it's like, well, it's a time-boxed review, so we have excuses as to why we miss stuff. But in general, what we found talking to protocol customers is an audit firm will generally give them like a fairly specific number of weeks, a fairly specific cost, and they don't say, hey, we'd like to audit this for a year or longer, and it's going to cost you $10 million. They usually give like 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And so the reason they do that is because they think, okay, we can do a reasonably thorough review in 2 or 3 weeks. That's kind of this assumption. And so yeah, consistently underscoping audits to avoid responsibility is kind of unprofessional, and if people are doing that, then that's kind of a different thing, and they should be evaluated based on why they're doing that, which would not be positive. So yeah, that's kind of the first assumption here. And then if we're going to evaluate audits consecutively, it creates a new problem. So audit number 1 gets evaluated against 4 other audits because number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 all go after audit number 1. Audit number 4 is only evaluated against audit number 5. So there's only one other audit team that can find bugs after audit number 4, whereas audit number 1, there's 4 other teams that can find bugs, so it's harder, and we need to take that into account. Audit number 5 just can't be fully evaluated because we have no idea what bugs were missed after audit number 5 because no other auditors participated after that. So the solution is we adjust for the amount of overlapping NSLOC in all subsequent audits. I'll come back to exactly how we do that later. Okay, this is the example. So let's say we have 3 audits, one in January, one in February, one in March. The third one, we can't fully evaluate it. Audit number 1 has 10 findings in 1,000 NSLOC, and they miss 6 things. Audit number 2 has 3 findings in 1,500 NSLOC, and they miss 4 things. And then audit number 3, there's 5 findings, but we don't know how many they missed, and so we can't easily evaluate audit number 3, but we can evaluate audit number 1 and 2. And we can do this, we assume these 10 findings are some severity that has been normalized, so maybe they're all high severity findings. And if you look at that, if you look at audit number 1 and audit number 2, which one would you think is more effective? Sorry? The Third one. So out of between number 1 and number 2, though, which one between those two? It's a little bit tricky. I mean, it's kind of difficult. Audit number 1 found way more stuff than audit number 2, 10 versus 3. They did it in a smaller code base, which is probably harder, but they did miss more findings than audit number 2. And so this is what we're going to try to do, is create a framework for how we can evaluate which one was more successful. Okay, so was audit number 1 or audit number 2 more effective? Like we just said, those are the stats, and 2,000 NSLOC aggregate overlap. So audit number 1 had a more difficult task because 2 auditors went after them, whereas with audit number 2, only 1 auditor went after them, and so they have a little bit easier task, and you can see that in the NSLOC overlap. Okay, audit number 1 had 2,000 NSLOC overlap, audit number 2 had 500 NSLOC overlap. That means that audit number 2, basically there was less ability for others to find stuff in audit number 2, and so audit number 1 had a tougher challenge. The way we're going to evaluate this, or at least the way that I've proposed is a possible path to evaluating it, is using this effectiveness score. So we're going to start with the vulnerabilities found by an auditor over the NSLOC they audited. Higher is better. If you find more vulnerabilities in a tiny amount of code, then that's pretty good. You know, we can assume that you did pretty well there. If you miss a lot of vulnerabilities and the NSLOC overlap is very small, so like the auditors that went after you, they only looked at a little bit of the code that you looked at. If you missed a lot of vulnerabilities and the overlap was very small, then that's bad. Because that means that people found a lot of vulnerabilities in a very small portion of the code, or very few people kind of looked at that code that you looked at, and they found a lot of stuff that you missed. So this final formula is basically putting those two things together and saying, let's take the ratio of what you found over what you audited, over what you missed, and what came after you in terms of how much audit power came after you. So was audit number 1 or number 2 more effective? Now that we have this formula, we can come up with some answers here, and we see that audit number 1, evaluated by this criteria, had a score of 3.3. Audit number 2 had a score of 0.25. The scores are not super relevant, except in comparison with each other. And so we can see from this that it's very likely that audit number 1 was more effective than audit number 2. And so my talk at 4 o'clock is going to be taking this framework and using it to evaluate actual audits that happened earlier this year. Sherlock obviously was 2 of them, in the first position and last position. Either the first or last position is probably going to be the worst and probably going to be the best, so I figured this was probably a decent one to evaluate, because Sherlock might look the worst, might look the best, you know, might have the best advantage or the worst advantage in terms of how this framework plays out. But basically, talk at 4 o'clock, we're going to go through all of the findings by these 6 audits, and we're going to basically evaluate, we're going to score each of these audits and determine which audits were very effective and which audits were less effective. And again, the reason for this is we're trying to figure out who is quantitatively performing well, who is quantitatively adding a lot of value to their clients, finding a lot of vulnerabilities in the code bases they're hired to look in, and who is performing less well relative to others. And I think that will be very valuable for the space in general. It will push the ones who are performing less well to improve, and it will also make sure that the ones who are performing well are being hired and being, being taken on by clients. So yeah, I think it should be pretty interesting, and we're basically going to score some of these audits and see who does the best. That's it.